Welcome to the Capital News. I am your host, Alex Koritis. Today is Thursday, April 2nd, 2020. Thank you so much for joining me. The title of today's podcast is Oil Plus War, Who Benefits? There's a lot I want to talk about today. These are going to be, like most topics here, an ongoing discussion because we're most definitely not going to be able to cover all of these line items in detail today. It's going to be, like I just said, a continuing conversation, as most things are on this podcast, because that's what we want to do. We want them to be ongoing discussions, and simply just by the nature of the topics that we discuss here primarily, that's how they operate. It's a process. These things take time to unwind and unravel and to reveal themselves. So there's a lot packed into this. Oil plus war, who benefits? Because I do think the war drums are beating. I have said it here repeatedly. I've stated it here many, many times since the beginning of this podcast back in February of last year. When all else fails, they take us to war, and we're going to get to that. So I want to cover market performance. I want to talk about unemployment. I want to talk about the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, because, again, they update that once a week, and so we have new numbers on that. I want to talk about President Trump meeting with oil executives and energy executives tomorrow. Since the title here is also involving war, I want to pose the question of war or some type of conflict, or at least saber-rattling, once again, with Venezuela. And then if we have time, there was an interesting interview today on CNBC with hedge fund manager and famous short seller, but he plays both sides of the markets, Jim Chanos. I'm sure many of you are aware of him if you pay attention to some of the financial media, Jim Chanos, and he had some interesting thoughts, as he usually does, which, again, he's one of the handful of people that I will pay attention to when they give an interview, when they speak, because I think they're a wealth of knowledge and you can learn a lot from them. And he had some interesting takes on what might happen after the dust settles with COVID-19 and some of the legislation that might come into effect, and how that might affect a lot of businesses, and some of the businesses and some of the stocks on Wall Street that have been the darlings of Wall Street, and how that might not be the case so much afterwards. So first, to some of the market performance. Despite over 6 million Americans filing for unemployment insurance just in 1 week alone, taking that into consideration with last week, with it slightly over 3 million, over the course of the last 2 weeks, 10 million Americans have filed for unemployment insurance. This is groundbreaking, earth-shattering numbers here. This is history in the making, like we've been saying here for quite a while. And this is not going to be any type of V-shaped recovery. These people are not going to go back to work very quickly, unfortunately. Not most of them, anyway. This is going to put the unemployment rate at who knows where by the time the dust settles on all of this. Remember, the Great Depression, you peaked about 25%. Even during the Great Financial Crisis, we peaked at about 10%. We might be at 10% right now, because you have 10 million Americans recently unemployed filing for unemployment insurance, but then you have a whole bunch of Americans who were already unemployed before that. So we could be at 10%. We'll get that number here shortly. This is going to have huge downstream effects for quite a while. But despite the fact that we got a number that was worse than market anticipation, market expectations, stocks rallied today. They rallied a couple percentage points. And I think a lot of that was on the back of the hopes that there's going to be some sort of deal that's going to be brokered, that it's in the works, that this oil war, this oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia is going to come to a conclusion. That's what President Donald Trump would have us believe. I'm not so certain this is the case, and there are some conflicting reports, because OPEC is saying, well, I don't know about this. Russia's saying the same thing. I don't know about this. I don't think that's going to be the case, that we're just going to curtail our supply just because Donald Trump tweeted it and made some comments about it. So right back, here we are again. The boy who cried wolf. Who to believe, what to believe. Where's the credibility? Right? Because the president is on all sides of this issue, which he tends to be on many. Before Oh, if oil prices are low, that's a fantastic thing. That's great news, ladies and gentlemen. It's one hell of a tax cut for everybody, for the consumer. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Now it's a concern. Now he's concerned about the oil industry and the gas industry. So which is it, Mr. President? Is it good for the consumer? Is it bad? Or is it both, right? Good for the consumer, bad for the energy industry? Well, who's the winner, loser this time? Who do you want to pick? Newsflash, ladies and gentlemen, it's not his job to decide who the winners are and who the losers are. That's the problem with this government. Not just Donald Trump. Democrats, Republicans, Obama, Bush, all of them. That is the problem. It is not the job of the government and central banks to pick winners and losers. It's the job of the free market. And who's the free market? You and me. We get to pay and vote with our dollars. That's how it works. That's who wins. That's who loses. They earn our business. Not who gets bailed out. Not who's buddy-buddy, chummy-chummy with whoever. Not who gives money to what campaign. The free market is supposed to solve this. So we're going to get to that. The market performance. Right now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ 100 are all down in overnight futures trading about 1%. We have the Japanese markets and open trading down about 0.5%. Today over in Europe, pretty much across the board in the green, except for the Spanish markets, just slightly down. And also we have the Australian markets trading right now. They are down 2.5 percentage points. And on the back of the strong recovery in oil prices off of these tweets and comments from the president, oil took off. And no surprise, we have the Russian stock market that closed up about 3 percentage points. Actually, today, off of this news from the president, despite the fact that the unemployment claims are through the roof, it got trumped by Trump with his comments on oil. And so today was the largest gain in history for oil prices, over 20-some percent. Now, at the time of this podcast, they've retreated some, but that's how big of an effect that single tweet caused. Again, this is market manipulation. The president knows what he's doing with this stuff. Just the rumor moves markets. We got these computers, these algorithms, doing all this trading, scouring his Twitter feed and the internet, looking for these types of things, and boom, they trade on this information. He understands this. You understand this because we've discussed this at length during the insanity of the trade negotiations between the United States and China just for phase one. How much market manipulation and craziness there was involved with that, with the daily tweets and headlines that turned out not to be true at all. I mean, here we are again. Is this going to be the next thing? But even if it is true, I am still sticking to my guns because I'm resorting and falling back on what I always fall back on here, and that's the fundamentals. What's the supply? What's the demand equation here? We are flush with supply. Flush with supply. Demand is going to continue to go down or stay at low levels. That means prices are going to go down further or remain where they are. Barring some type of major geopolitical event, these prices are staying where they are for the foreseeable future. Yeah, they could spike, but that's what I'm saying. They're going to come back down because of the underlying supply and demand dynamics. But nonetheless, we have crude oil, WTI, trading at $23.97 a barrel. Brent, the international metric, is at $28.63 a barrel. Natural gas still getting walloped, $1.56 per million British thermal units. Gold is back above $1,600 an ounce, trading at $1,612 an ounce. Silver also rallied a little bit today and is up, trading at $14.42. On the bond front, Uncle Sam's 10-year Treasury note is down slightly further, yielding 0.58%. 0.58. So that's some of the market performance. The Fed's balance sheet. You know, last week we talked about the Fed's balance sheet, and like I said, I hope to maybe make this at least part of our weekly discussion as we move forward here, because this, again, is history in the making. They are printing money like it's going out of style, as I like to say, because it is. And they are completely vertical right now. And again, you can find this Federal Reserve economic data, Fred. Google it, find it, search bar, just type in the word assets, and it'll come up assets, total assets, less eliminations, and there's your graph. There is the total assets on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. You ready for this? $5.8 trillion. $5.8 trillion. It peaked prior to all of this insanity in the previous round of insanity with QE1, QE2, Operation Twist, QE3, about $4.5 trillion, maybe 4.6 at its highest. Now we're at 5.8, virtually overnight. I mean, I am speechless from this. This is so criminal, what they are doing. They are printing money and buying assets. The Federal Reserve is going to end up owning everything. Owning everything. They're going to end up buying shares before this is all said and done. And some people already think that that is taking place. Now, by their charter, that's not supposed to happen. But, I mean, so many things aren't supposed to happen, and they are. So who's to say, right? But these guys start buying shares outright. That means they own the companies. Again, this is a complete financial coup d'etat right in front of our noses. And nobody's in Congress. They're not even there. They're on vacation. They're on vacation. I mean, why not, right? They're always on vacation to begin with. They're not working. And when they do, they just do something to screw us over to begin with. So, I mean, isn't that grand? Global pandemic, all this stuff. Yeah, we'll all go home. We'll all go on vacation. Okay, good. Go on vacation. Stay there. Don't come back, please. Resign. Call it a day. You've done enough. Thank you. $5.8 trillion. And there's no end in sight. There's no end in sight because, I mean, theoretically, with the money that was just allocated to the administration through the Treasury that's going to be in the hands of the Federal Reserve, I mean, you know, they're going to be able to multiply those hundreds of billions into trillions. So the Fed's balance sheet, by the time this is all said and done, can double from where it was at 4.6 trillion, and it might go further. So you're talking about a Fed balance sheet that could be anywhere from $8 to $10 trillion, maybe even more. Maybe even more. And if it gets up to $10 trillion, that's 50% of U.S. GDP. 50%, if just to round the numbers, make it nice and easy for conversation purposes. We got a GDP of about 20 trillion, right? Fed's balance sheet gets to 10. There you have it. The Fed's balance sheet is 50% of gross domestic product. And then if you look at the ECB and the Bank of Japan and others, I mean, they're already there too. They've been out of control. They got the pedal to the metal, and they're going to do the same thing. $5.8 trillion. I mean, it's unbelievable to wrap our minds around this number and what they're purchasing. They're purchasing treasuries. They're purchasing mortgage-backed securities. They're basically the market in the overnight repo market, right? We understand this. We talk about this. Commercial paper, mortgage-backed securities on the residential side. Now they're authorized to buy commercial mortgage-backed securities because the commercial real estate market is going to collapse. There's pretty much no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're now allowed to buy corporate paper primarily straight from them, straight from corporations, whoever they deem to be investment grade, by the way. So whatever definition that meets, the Federal Reserve is going to buy them directly on the primary market, and then they can also purchase them through the ETFs on the secondary market. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So they're getting to pick their winners and losers, and as I stated here the other night, we're already seeing a huge increase from those corporations that are deemed quote-unquote investment grade, issuing debt because they know they have a buyer, the Federal Reserve. Talk about consolidation. Talk about a good old boys club. This is it. This is it. And that comes down to the question of today's podcast, right? Oil plus war, who benefits? Well, if you are going to be in the midst of an oil price war, which we most definitely are, you ask yourself who benefits. What's the target? Who's the target? What's the end game here? Because they're not just doing this. They're not just doing this to flex their muscle. There is an end game. That's the problem with, sort of geopolitical, strategy, right? It's all theory, at least to us, the laymen, because we're not diplomats. We're not behind closed doors. We're not privy to this classified information and what the end game is. So all we can really do is speculate and talk about it, but try to look at their actions. Listen to their words, but pay more attention to their actions, right? And try to put this very complex puzzle together to try to understand what might be taking place. Because I don't believe that Vladimir Putin and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia are just doing this for the hell of it. Somebody is benefiting from this at the end of the day. And who is that? Who is benefiting at the end of the day? Who are they trying to target? Could it be that simple that, maybe they are just playing strongmen, trying to go at each other, and that's it? Could be, but I don't think so, because there's going to be countries that benefit from this. Those are going to be the countries that are major importers of oil. Who comes to mind immediately is China. So is this a way of both Saudi Arabia and Russia, because they would love to have the Chinese market, because you're talking about 1.4 billion people. Wouldn't they love it? Okay? So China benefits because they are a huge importer of oil, so they love the low prices. They're a beneficiary of this. Who gets hurt in a lot of this, especially immediately? We do. The U.S. energy industry does. Because we have so much debt to pump this stuff out of the ground, it'll make your head spin. And a lot of it is not profitable. They have to pump so much money into the ground, it's sometimes not even profitable for these companies. But they can make a paycheck. They can pay themselves handsomely on the other side of it and let the companies go bust. And that's what's going to take place here. We talked about the bankruptcy yesterday, Whiting Petroleum. That's what they did. They filed bankruptcy, but before they did, they gave their executives $15 million in cash bonuses. Okay? That's the game. That's the system. And we have a government at the helm, Republicans, Democrats, and the President of the United States, who wants to bail everybody out under the convenient excuse, which I highlighted in my letter, Representation and Recourse. Check it out on our website, The Capital News, that politicians and central bankers were going to use COVID-19 as a convenient excuse to get away with everything under the sun, to justify the unjustifiable. Well, here it is again. Another industry coming to Washington, D.C. on bended knee, and they're going to get bailed out. They're going to get bailed out. They might play tough, especially some of these big boys, your Exxon Mobils, your Chevrons, blah, blah, blah. We got money, we got resources, we don't need bailed out. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? They're going to get a bailout. They're going to get some sort of assistance. They're going to get something where somebody gets saved and somebody goes away. Because these guys are also going to benefit at the end of the day too, the bigger boys. Because the smaller ones are going out of business. So they get to suck up all of that market share. They didn't have to compete. They just had to sit there. They're just going to have to go to Washington, D.C. tomorrow, sit around that big table. The cameras will come in. Donald Trump will have them all introduce themselves, and then they'll all praise and thank Donald Trump. And then they'll get bailed out. They just got to kiss the president's rear end for 15 minutes on camera, and they'll all get bailed out. And they'll all be able to pick up the market share from some of these companies that are going to go out of business, or they're going to be able to buy them up for pennies on the dollar. Didn't have to do a damn thing. That's the system. That's the system. And politicians and a whole bunch of Americans think it's worth salvaging. I don't think the system's worth salvaging. Let free market solve this problem. Then you'll see what kind of system we have at the end of the day. Hopefully the better one. A restoration of our constitutional republic and restoration of free market capitalism. That'll solve this. But we're not allowed to solve problems here. We got to keep the pain going on and on and on. We got to keep this madness going on and on and on. Until one day it doesn't. And I think we're nearing that day. And it's going to be painful for a lot of people. It already is. 10 million Americans unemployed over the last 2 weeks. And this was prior to the president's announcement that we're going to be pretty much on complete lockdown or close to at least social distancing measures in place for the next 30 days. So this is only going to get worse, okay? Much worse before it gets better. So these energy executives are going to come. They're going to kiss the rear end of the president. They'll talk about whatever, we're going to cut back on our production, which they're already in the process of doing because they have to, some of them, if they can afford it. That's some of the bigger ones. These smaller guys, they got to keep going because they got debt service to pay. They got to get money to pay the debt. All right? But we already know that a lot of their capital expenditures are frozen. We see in some sectors, or some European banks the other day suspended their dividends. I imagine that is going to be something that starts making its way over here in the United States as well. There's going to be suspension of dividends or the cutting of dividends. Stocks will go off. They'll sell off of that news most likely, like they did with a lot of the European banks who announced this the other day. But they can't issue stock, right? They can buy it back for a decade, but God forbid they issue new shares to try to raise capital. No, why do that when you can come to Washington, D.C. and ask these politicians for our money? Because they gave it to them. It's bailout nation. So this whole war thing is going to get interesting just with the price of oil. But what about a hot war? What about a kinetic war? Perhaps with Venezuela again. And the reason I bring them up now is because, and I didn't talk about this yesterday, but during the president's daily COVID-19 conference or update, before he got to COVID-19, he had sort of the Defense Department and the Attorney General and some others give an update as to what the United States is doing in regards to the quote-unquote war on drugs. And they announced a very, very aggressive strategy whereby we already have U.S. assets, primarily through the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, in the Pacific Ocean, in the Caribbean, that is pretty much surrounding Venezuela. Now, they're using, I think, as a distraction, as an excuse, the drug war. They're stepping up our efforts. We're not going to allow these drug cartels the opportunity to use the chaos that is ensuing because of COVID-19 and the economic collapse as an excuse, as an opportunity to penetrate the United States and to flood our streets with more cocaine and other drugs. Yet they cite Venezuela. Very little cocaine comes from Venezuela. Most of it is coming from Colombia. Most of it is coming up through Mexico or along the Pacific coast. Venezuela is not on the Pacific coast. It's in the Caribbean. It's on the Atlantic side. Okay? And you have to remember, and we talked about this a couple months ago during the President's State of the Union address. Remember who one of his guests of honor was? It was Juan Guaido. Remember Juan Guaido? He's our puppet. He's the guy, he's the cat who was down there in Venezuela, who stood in the town square and declared himself El Presidente of Venezuela, right? He just declared himself the president. And the United States of America said, he said it. He was there, and he claims he's the president, so we're going to back him. I'm 32 years old. I can be the president when I'm 35. I'm going to go down to Washington, D.C. I'm going to stand in the middle of the National Mall, and I'm going to declare myself the president of the United States. They're going to lock me up and throw away the key. Okay? But that's what our government just did. We are backing somebody who stood in the center of the town square and basically said, I am the president, and we are backing him. Now, of course, he's most definitely a puppet of the United States, of the CIA. No, there's no question in my mind about this. But he was a guest of the president. And I said, let's pay attention to this, because why would he be there? Why would he be there? Because they tried overthrowing the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Didn't happen, right? Did not work. And then it sort of subsided. You didn't hear much about it for quite a while. Until lo and behold, one day, a couple months ago, State of the Union address, there he is, sitting up there in the halls of Congress as the president is giving his State of the Union address. And of course, he mentions him during his speech. And I said, okay, here we go. Let's start connecting the dots. Why is this guy there? What are we positioning for? Because, this was on the back burner. Now it might become front and center once again. So the Justice Department, under the Attorney General Bill Barr, has indicted, I believe, the Maduro regime and himself, basically considering him a drug trafficker. All right? Now, what's interesting about Bill Barr indicting a foreigner is this isn't his first rodeo. Bill Barr did this before, when he was the Attorney General for President George H.W. Bush. He did virtually the exact same thing in Panama, in Noriega. It's the same people, folks. It is the same corrupt system with the same people. You get what I'm saying here? We went into Panama. Don't be surprised if we end up in Venezuela now, because we're well positioned. Because this whole war on drugs is ridiculous. If there was truly a war on drugs, you could send a platoon of United States Marines down there to Mexico and Colombia, and these guys would be wiped out in a week. Okay? And if anybody doubts that, go talk to a Marine. I mean, this is ridiculous. And if you understand the government, and if you've actually read some declassified documents and have actually went beyond Fox News and CNN and the mainstream media and actually do some digging and find and look up true investigative journalists, you'll understand that the U.S. government, especially through the CIA, is heavily involved with drug trafficking. Okay? So here we are. We have one sector of the government who is involved in the drug trafficking, probably exchanging God knows what, weapons, munitions, intelligence, siding and picking one cartel over the next, playing them off of each other, doing who knows what. The money being laundered through our financial system, and I'm going to talk about that because that's huge. And then we have an entire different apparatus with the FBI, police department, state police, DEA, ATF, everybody else who goes after them. This is our government. This is what's going on. But look that up, because that's the truth. So we have a convenient argument right now. There's chaos. There's COVID-19, again, a very convenient excuse for governments around the world to get away with whatever they want to do. We're not going to allow drugs into our country. No, no, no. And Venezuela is the culprit. What else does Venezuela have, by the way? Oh, yeah, that's right. The world's largest oil reserves. Ain't that just a coincidence, too? Man, I'm batting 1,000 tonight. One coincidence after the other. That's all they are. They're just coincidences. That's it. Couldn't be anything. We better be careful, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you. When all else fails, they take us to war. And what's also interesting is you may be familiar with the Russian oil energy company Rosneft. Now, of course, they were sort of quasi-owned by the Russian government to begin with, semi-private, however you want to classify them. The Russian government has now completely nationalized Rosneft, which sort of makes me scratch my head and wonder, are the Russians understanding what we, the Americans, might be doing, getting ready to do? And are they saying, well, if the United States attacks or goes after some of the oil interests, if it was a private or semi-private company, maybe Russia wouldn't have much of a leg to stand on for any sort of retaliation. But now that it's actually a Russian government-owned company, if something happens to that company, now they're going to say, oh, that's an act of war because we own it. Those are our resources. You attacked a government-owned company. That's an act of war. Could that just have been something that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government did to sort of deter our efforts from going down there? Because the Russians and the Chinese are there. And evidently, we're trying to get there too. We're there. There's no question about it, because we put Guaido in. He's our guy. He's our puppet. This is far from over. And I've stated it here repeatedly. Yeah, it might be on the back burner, but it'll come back, and here it is. Here it is. I could be wrong. Maybe we actually are fighting the drug war. I don't think so. Again, if you wanted to do it, send a platoon of Marines down there, and it's done in a week. But I don't think that's going to happen. And I do want to talk about Mexico too, but I want to first get to the drug laundering with the money. All right? The money laundering. Every action has a reaction. I don't care if you're talking about physics. I don't care if you're talking about politics, geopolitics, or economics. So we can stand up here, we can, beat our chests and pretend to be tough guys and patriots, and we're going to fight these cartels, and we're going to be doing this, that, and the other. That's fine. I don't have any problem with taking these drugs off the street. But guess what happens with all that money? Do you understand fractional reserve banking? Do you understand how the banking system works? Do you understand how much illegal money is in our banking system? Do you understand the degree of money laundering that exists within this country? Take that away, and what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, that's right. Collapse. The financial system will collapse. Just because of that, just because of the illegal money, if it got drained because we clamped down on all of these drugs, right? No sale, no cash. So no money to launder. The banking system would dry up. Because the average Joe and Jane ain't making enough money. They're not making Pablo Escobar money. They're not making El Chapo money. Okay? They're living paycheck to paycheck. El Chapo has their annual salary in his back pocket. Okay? He makes that daily. Maybe hourly. You understand what I'm talking about here? You understand how much illicit money is in the system? Then if you understand fractional reserve banking, they get to multiply that by a factor of 9 or 10 times. Billions, if not trillions of dollars, when it's all said and done. So that's fine. We can be the tough guy. We can clamp down on these cartels. But then where's the money go? It's gone. And with it, the financial system. And with it, the economy. Now, you want to throw that gasoline onto this fire that's already burning in this country? Be my guest. But you better be ready for what comes on the other side of it. And then you have Mexico, which a lot of people already argue is a narco state to begin with. But now, because they are in recession, because the United States, for all intents and purposes, is in recession, may be headed for a depression, that means Mexico will also be in a depression. Borders are going to be closed up. They're not going to be able to get into the United States. What are they going to do? They're either going to look for the cartels to make any type of money whatsoever, or they're going to riot and protest their governments because they can't make a living. There's no money. They can't feed their families. They can't afford their homes, their cars, their lifestyle. This is far from over, ladies and gentlemen. I told you, these protests are going to come to a theater near you. Well, Mexico's right there. It's right next door. And it will be coming here to this country as well. Believe me when I tell you. I hope it doesn't, but it's going to. It will, especially in the bigger cities, because of the supply chain, food, all that stuff. There's going to be shortages. There's going to be major price increases. People aren't going to go back to work. $1,200 can't leave. People are going to lose it. People are going to lose it. Believe me. All right, it's coming. We've seen it around the world. It's coming to our hemisphere. Mexico could completely crater. Because they're heavily dependent on the cartels too. So if we really do clamp down on the cartels, well, that economy is going to collapse further than what it is as well. Okay? And if we go to war, who's that going to benefit? Well, I guess it's going to benefit those oil companies because the price of oil will probably go up. Who has to finance all of this madness? Oh, that's right, the banks. So now the banks are going to make huge fees off of financing another war that we can't afford. Who benefits, ladies and gentlemen? Always, always, always ask that question. It is one of our rules of the cynic in our book, The Cynic's Guide to Investing. Always ask that question. And I've been asking that question on a couple things surrounding COVID-19, and I don't like the answers I'm coming up with. And I'm debating whether to bring those up with this audience or not, because I don't like them, and it's somewhat conspiratorial, and I don't want to go down that road. That's not what this podcast is. But I don't like the answer. When I ask the question, who benefits from COVID-19, I don't like the answers I come up with. So do your own thinking on that. And don't lie to yourself. Don't try to disillusion yourself. Don't try to put the United States above it all. Go down that rabbit hole and send me your comments, because I'd like to be, if I get some comments on that, then maybe I'll bring it up and I'll share my thoughts as well. Because that's the ultimate question, who benefits? And like I stated many times here before, the word is consolidation, and we are just getting started. It's bailout nation. It's a banana republic. It's nationalization. And I have no idea when it's going to end. I have no idea what these markets are going to do. I have seen so much volatility in the stock market, in the bond market, in the currency market. It's dangerous to trade. It really is. And that's not my game to begin with, but sometimes I'll get in there for maybe a swing trade here or there. I mean, it's back and forth. It is the wild, wild west out there. And I listen to a lot of people who have been in the game for 30, 40 years, and almost to a man or woman, they all say they've never seen anything like this in their entire careers. So if you think you know what you're talking about, you don't. Okay? That's just the truth of it. We have no idea what's going to happen. We have no idea if these idiots in the White House and the Congress and the Federal Reserve are going to be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat, and the idiots on Wall Street and the crackheads are going to say, oh, well, okay, everything's fine. Fed balance sheet is at $5.8 trillion. Maybe next week it's at $7.5. Well, that did it. Everything's fine. We can go back to normal. I don't think that's going to happen, but maybe it will. Maybe it will. There's more crackheads and idiots walking around than there are sane people who ask logical questions. So they're the ones at the helm. Anything's possible. Markets go up. Maybe there's some sort of crack up bust, or crack up boom because of all of the money printing. Maybe it turns into inflation, hyperinflation at the consumer level. You know my thoughts, but I don't know what's going to happen. That's why you got to stay diversified. That's why you got to stay vigilant. That's why you got to stay with the Capital News. I'll catch you guys here tomorrow. I am Alex Koritis. Godspeed.